Most people who remember Evinrude shutting down in 2020 tell the story the same way. COVID hit, the outboard market was already brutal, and a brand more than 100 years old finally ran out of road. That story is true, but it is not the real story, and almost nobody talks about the actual one. Evinrude did not collapse once. It collapsed twice, roughly 20 years apart, for eerily similar reasons both times, and in between those two collapses, the exact same parent company had already killed a second legendary outboard name so quietly that most boaters never even noticed it happened. This is the real history of how a company that invented the entire outboard industry ended up betting twice on the same kind of risky engine technology, one that was different from everyone else's, at two different points in its history, and lost both times, taking two of the biggest names in boating down with it along the way. Ole Evinrude founded his company in Milwaukee in 1907 after developing a one-cylinder outboard motor that hit the market in 1909. Company legend, repeated for over a century and never fully verified, says Ole got the idea rowing 2 miles out on a lake to fetch his fiancée Bess an ice cream, only to row back and find it melted, and decided right then someone needed to invent a motor for a rowboat. Whether that story is completely true or not, the idea worked immediately. Bolt a small engine to the back of a boat and never row again. Ole Evinrude briefly sold the company in 1913 due to Bess's declining health, sat out a 5-year non-compete clause he had agreed to as part of that sale, then came back in 1920 with a new twin-cylinder design under the name Elto, short for Evinrude Light Twin Outboard. His son Ralph eventually merged that operation with rival Johnson Motor Company in 1936, forming Outboard Marine Corporation, or OMC, a single company that would go on to control both of the biggest names in outboards for the rest of the century. The first collapse started with a bet on new technology. By the 1990s, tightening EPA emissions rules meant OMC's traditional two-stroke engines needed a cleaner way to burn fuel, so the company partnered with a German firm called Ficht to build a direct fuel injection system that would inject gas straight into the cylinder instead of mixing it with oil beforehand. The idea was sound, and on paper it should have solved the emissions problem while keeping every advantage a two-stroke has over a heavier four-stroke. The execution was not sound at all. Ficht-equipped engines suffered widespread powerhead failures out in the field, forcing recalls and warranty claims that piled up faster than the new technology could be fixed. And the reputation damage combined with fierce competition from Mercury and Japanese manufacturers pushed OMC into Chapter 11 bankruptcy on December 22, 2000. A company that had defined the outboard industry for 93 straight years ran out of money largely because of one failed engineering bet it could not walk back in time, a lesson BRP would eventually learn had not actually been learned at all. In 2001, Bombardier Recreational Products, known as BRP, a Canadian company built primarily around Ski-Doo snowmobiles and Sea-Doo personal watercraft rather than boats or outboards, bought the wreckage for what industry observers at the time described as a genuinely attractive price: the Evinrude brand, the Johnson brand, and the failed Ficht technology along with all of it. Instead of walking away from direct injection entirely, BRP's engineers spent years re-engineering Ficht into something that actually held up under real use, branding the result E-TEC. It was a genuine technical turnaround rather than a rebrand, and by 2008 the same core direct injection technology was proven reliable enough that BRP put it into Ski-Doo snowmobiles too, where it remains in use to this day. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe, because here's the part almost nobody mentions. BRP already killed one of these 2-century-old brands years before Evinrude ever went away. Through most of the 2000s, BRP kept both Johnson and Evinrude alive side by side, Johnson selling its own two-stroke line through 175 horsepower plus rebadged Suzuki 4-strokes, while Evinrude got the new E-TEC direct injection technology as its flagship. But running two nearly identical outboard lines under one roof never made lasting business sense, especially once stricter EPA and California emissions rules made supporting two separate carbureted and injected two-stroke platforms even more expensive. In 2007, BRP quietly discontinued the entire Johnson brand and consolidated everything under the Evinrude name alone. One of the two oldest names in outboard history, a brand that had been racing and innovating since the 1920s, disappeared with barely a headline, 13 full years before its sibling brand suffered the exact same fate. The second collapse took much longer to arrive, and on paper, Evinrude's engineering was genuinely impressive right up until the end. In 2014, BRP launched E-TEC G2, a from-scratch redesign built around a 3.4-liter V6 block, ranging from 200 horsepower high output up to 300, with built-in power steering hidden inside the engine itself, an optional joystick docking system, and BRP's own claims of 20% more torque and 75% lower emissions than comparable four-strokes, backed by a 5-year warranty with no dealer-scheduled maintenance required for the first 5 years or 500 hours. It was a real engineering achievement, not a marketing gimmick, and it earned genuine respect even from skeptical reviewers who tested it directly against four-stroke competitors from Mercury and Yamaha. But 300 horsepower was also the absolute ceiling. BRP later filled in the smaller mid-range down to 150 horsepower, but never once built anything bigger, while Yamaha introduced its 425 horsepower XTO offshore, weighing in at 952 pounds, and Mercury answered with a supercharged 450 horsepower 450R, weighing under 700 pounds, over 300 pounds lighter than rival high-output engines in that same class. Evinrude's own product marketing manager admitted publicly in an on-record industry interview that the company was fighting an uphill battle against, in his words, four-stroke bias among saltwater anglers specifically. While its two biggest rivals kept climbing a horsepower ladder, Evinrude had no engine on the shelf to compete on. Underneath the horsepower gap sat a structural problem that had nothing to do with engineering at all. By the 2010s, the outboard industry had shifted almost entirely toward vertical integration. Engine makers owning the boat, brands their own motors get bolted onto straight from the factory floor. Mercury has Brunswick's entire boat portfolio, from Boston Whaler to Sea Ray, sitting behind it. Yamaha has its own boat-building arm supplying rigged boats worldwide. BRP, a snowmobile and personal watercraft company at heart, did not build its own comparable marine group until surprisingly late in the game, acquiring aluminum boat builders Alumacraft and Manitou in 2018 and the Australian builder Telwater, maker of Quintrex boats, in 2019, just 1 year before everything ended. For most of its modern life, Evinrude was selling primarily into the aftermarket repower business instead of riding inside factory-built boats the way its two biggest competitors did from day one. And that meant Evinrude was always fighting for scraps of a market Mercury, and Yamaha had already locked down from the boat builder's side of the deal, years before BRP ever tried to close that same gap. Then came 2020. On May 27th, BRP announced it was immediately discontinuing all Evinrude outboard production, effective that same day, with no wind-down period and no warning given in advance to Evinrude's own dealer network. CEO Jose Boisjoli's own statement did not blame the horsepower race or the four-stroke shift directly. It named the pandemic as the final trigger, sitting on top of problems that were already there, stating plainly that the outboard engine business had been greatly impacted by COVID-19 and that the segment had already been facing challenges before the pandemic ever forced the company's hand. The Sturtevant, Wisconsin factory, the same facility that had built Evinrude outboards for decades, was set aside to be, in BRP's own words, repurposed for new projects, without the company specifying at the time what those projects would actually be. Every job tied to that outboard business, Manufacturing, engineering, marketing, and sales built specifically around the Evinrude name ended that same week, affecting workers across Wisconsin and beyond who had no idea a shutdown of this scale was even being considered. BRP did not disappear from boating entirely. It kept its marine group of boat brands running and, not long after killing its own engine line, signed Mercury, the same rival whose horsepower race had just helped end Evinrude a second time, as the preferred engine supplier for those very same boats. Boats that once rolled off the assembly line with an Evinrude bolted to the transom, brands like Manitou pontoons and Alumacraft fishing boats, now shipped straight from the factory with a Mercury 4-stroke installed instead. E-TEC technology itself survived, just not on the water. It still powers Ski-Doo snowmobiles today. The exact product category BRP was originally built around before it ever got into outboards at all. BRP committed to roughly 10 years of parts support for existing Evinrude owners, a window running out somewhere around 2030, mirroring almost exactly the same support timeline it had already given Johnson owners after that quieter, far less publicized shutdown back in 2007. The real story of Evinrude was never really about one pandemic ending a 100-year-old company overnight. It is the story of a business that gambled on aggressive, different from everyone else engine technology, not once, but twice, watched that same basic gamble fail twice, and along the way, quietly buried one of its own legendary sibling brands with almost nobody noticing at the time. History did not repeat itself here by accident or bad luck. It repeated because nothing about the second collapse was actually new, the same pattern of chasing a bold technical bet while the rest of the industry consolidated around simpler, safer 4-stroke power and vertically integrated boat brands had already played out once before, just with a different decade, a different name on the transom, and a different excuse sitting on top of the same underlying problem. If this video taught you something you didn't already know, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments if you ever ran a Johnson, an Evinrude, or an E-TEC yourself.